Welcome. I'm Harmony Slater, your host of the Finding Harmony podcast. Over the past 20 years, I've taught thousands of yoga teachers and students to explore the intersection between ancient wisdom and modern everyday life, using mind-body practices to heal, awaken, and manifest their dreams from the inside out. This podcast is a sanctuary for those feeling overwhelmed by life's challenges. Are you ready to jump in and discover how these challenges aren't actually in the way, but are the way to finding harmony? Let's invite the magic back in. Well, hello. I'm so happy you're here. We are once again meeting with a dear friend and philosophical scholar and teacher, Dr. Shyam Ranganathan. You might remember Dr. Shyam Ranganathan from one of our first interviews back in 2020. We connected with him, and since then he has written an entirely new book, a beautiful book, to add to his collection of books and papers. But he's focusing on the ethics, moral and political philosophy, specializing in the philosophy of language, of thought, of the philosophy of religion, as well as Southeast Asian philosophy. And he really gets into exploring how the traditions and interpretations have been affected by certain regions and areas taking on a more colonial perspective, and what is inherent to the language and to the work without these other lenses. And so we're going to really dive into his new book and ask some really great questions about the yoga tradition and the yoga philosophy, based on the Yoga Sutras, but also looking at philosophy in a greater context. So I think you will really get a lot out of this. Get your notebook, get a pen. We are diving in to learning more about yoga from a scholarly perspective and a philosophical lens that is back to the roots, back to the origin of the language itself. So let's dive right in. Hi, welcome to the Finding Harmony podcast. I'm here today with Russell Case.
Good morning.
Hi, Russell. And we are joined by Dr. Shyam Ranganathan, and we're going to talk about his beautiful book.
It's an essential text, I think, especially if you have a yoga teacher training that's currently up. I think it would serve your students well to pass around this text and go through them chapter by chapter. There's beautiful questions at the end of each chapter for people to think about. How am I decolonizing myself? And I'd say that's a universal experience that we could all practice. Is I think we're all kind of traumatized by colonization.
What do you think, Shyam?
Yeah. Well, I explained like what we call colonization is like a version of where the Indian South Asian tradition starts with this kind of observation that we live in a universe that's imposing itself on us all the time. Prakriti, nature. There's always an external influence, and on the extreme, it seems like there's no room for us at all as persons if everything's already causally determined by some external factor. That's where yoga and comes in as a response to external pressure, and that's why Kaivalya autonomy is seen as the outcome of the practice, but the practice is devotion to Ishvara sovereignty. And so that practice was about recovering your independence in a universe that doesn't really make that easy. And so when we talk about colonialism now, that's our social version of the same problem. So there isn't really anything new. So like a lot of times people think that you have to decolonize your yoga practice. I say just learn yoga right? They
That's
just
good.
actually learn yoga, because yoga was always about this challenge we have to be independent.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit more about Ishvara Pranidhana being a devotion or dedication to sovereignty and how that naturally then leads to the state of Kaivalya, which
Good,
is like
thanks.
aloneness or uh,
Autonomy.
autonomy.
Yeah,
We're
yeah,
gonna
yeah.
set a
So it's
baseline.
yeah. So like, so aloneness is fine, but what are you alone? Like, what does that mean? Like, what does it mean
Yeah,
to be separate? It means you're not coerced,
right.
right? So how does devotion to Ishvara get us there? Well, when we're devoted to Ishvara, what does it mean to be devoted to something like Ishvara? It is to take on the challenge of being like that. That's what a devotion is that you value it so much you want to emulate that. You want to be close to that. What does it mean to be close to sovereignty? That means the closer you are to sovereignty, the more independent you are, right? So
Right.
the pranidhana, the image is actually coming up close. It also has the imagery of prostration. And so when we're approximating or getting close to sovereignty, we're becoming sovereign ourselves. How does that work? Well, there are two basic traits of Ishvara. It's not constrained by its past,
Mm-hmm.
so it's untouched by its own prior choices and activities. It doesn't have baggage, and then it's also not afflicted, which means that it's free to move forward,
Mm.
um, and to choose in ways and to live in a way that it determines itself. So, so what does that practice look like? Well, in addition to being devoted to Ishvara, we take on the practice of challenging ourselves so we're not stuck in our past tapas. And then we also take on the challenge of um, choosing our own values that we want to live by, swadhyaya. And then, but that means that we kind of examine ourselves, we determine ourselves. So, so there's a very long answer, but the basic idea is that it's something that the closer we get to, the more we're like. The closer I am to sovereignty, the more independent I am.
Mm. I love this link of tapas being because it's usually translated more as like austerity or
Yeah.
discipline, and it being linked to releasing yourself from the past,
Yes.
and then Ishwara, or sorry,
Swadhyaya.
Swadhyaya being the removal of the, you know, I guess projections of ourself into the future.
Well, what we're doing is we're allowing ourselves to choose the values that we live by so that
Mm-hmm.
we create a future that's determined by ourselves. So we're
Right.
free from our past. We're not constrained by our past. We're unconservative,
Mm-hmm.
and then we're also self-governing. So so tapas. It means heat production.
Mm-hmm.
How do you produce heat? Friction. So there's a kind of pushing back against
Mm.
constraints that's
Yeah.
built into the notion itself. But whenever you think about an example of tapas, it's something difficult that you couldn't do before, right? So you're really challenging yourself to overcome past habits and constraints when
Yeah.
you're engaging in it.
You mentioned in your book that there's this is a essential struggle for the new student to confuse yoga and meditation and philosophy when it sounds like from the way that you described it they're so much more interlinked that um, when you're engaged in the practice of yoga, you are engaged in the practice of meditation, you are engaged in a practice of dialogue philosophically.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. Because you're taking responsibility for your own thinking. So the yoga's chitta vritti nirodha. That's the way it starts, right? You're being responsible, controlling thoughts. You're bringing them to a conclusion. That's what we do when we formulate arguments. We're making space for ourselves to choose, but also to get over our past hangups. It's all very philosophical to really kind of push beyond what seemed familiar just because we were used to it, to really challenge ourselves, to think in different ways, to contemplate new options, and to own our own choices. So all of that happens when you take philosophy education seriously. And the South Asian word for meditation is yoga. So the whole thing is in Buddhism, they have these meditative practices that come at the end of the eighth to the full path. So you start off just with like right action and right livelihood, and then you build yourself up to these advanced states of like mental processing. But in yoga, we start off that way. We dive in, taking responsibility for thinking, organizing our thoughts, so that we are choosing clearly, right? So we're not doing it under a cloud of confusion. That's a completely philosophical endeavor, but it's also what counts as meditation according to the yoga tradition.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because you start really looking at what kind of dynamics you bring to the table when you get into a yoga room, and you look at the habits that got you there and the habits that inhibit you in that
Right.
room. And I'm reminded of a conversation that we had with Dr. Ralph Craig, who did the Tina Turner Buddhism book, Dancing in My Dreams.
Mm-hmm.
And it was interesting, like his the conversation that we had with him kind of helped me realize just how, fundamentally trapped or attached I am to a kind of colonial perspective, which is as a Scandinavian, my instinct is to go abroad, and what the word that he used was excavate whatever I can find there, and bring it home for
Personal
for
consumption.
mercantile choices, right?
That's funny.
And there's this like whole kind of Victorian archetype of like the sailor or the explorer going abroad
Yeah.
and becoming an interesting person on the grand tour. They
Yeah.
become interesting because they go out and
Right. They had
explore.
all these life experiences,
And how
right?
crazy they shot a tiger in India,
Yeah,
and
right.
they're
That's
literally
great.
killed by people, by a tribe in Africa, and they come home and then they live in this giant manor because of all the stuff they stole
Cool.
and
Yeah, yeah.
sold. And like that's the kind of archetype that I think we're still kind of conditioned to be and to live in. And
Yeah.
even the yoga teacher who grew up in in Ohio, who goes to India, or just maybe goes to New York, studies
Right.
with Eddie Stern, comes back to Ohio. Now they have something to sell.
Yeah. So I think yoga, like making a living, being prosperous, that's part of being autonomous. So we shouldn't. There's no way to be autonomous if you're like impoverished and starving, right? So there, and sharing your practice with others is a perfectly reasonable and non-manipulative way to make a living, right? So if you're actually engaged in a yoga practice and you're sharing this with others and you're being remunerated for that, that's great. But it only holds true if it's an actual yoga practice, right? So then what's that? And I don't, for in the book I talk about the way whack yoga, Western appropriated culture, where you have these Western samskaras that are kind of deep and historical, and then Westerners bring these samskaras with them, and then they recreate these Western political institutions, but with like Indian words and clothing and namaste and stuff. And there's like three main ones. There's the Plato's Republic guru at the top pyramid scheme.
Yeah.
There's not yoga, but it gets replicated all the time. Then there's the Aristotle's ethics. You have to be raised properly. You have to be enculturated to know. And so then these are the people that love to like change their name, say namaste even at the end of a class when it means hello, right? For them, it's all performance. It's all about cultural performance because that's what it is to show you know. And then there is also the stoicism where it's all like your job isn't to change anything, it's just to be kind of learn to be comfortable with the way things are. And so then yoga is marketed as a way to kind of deal with your anxiety or depression or something. It's not actually to change your life, just to kind of feel okay about it.
Mm-hmm.
So what you described was very interesting, but like in a way, like the the that the huckster that kind of sells their global globetrot, it would only work if you had all of these other things in the background, right? Where
Mm.
somehow it was about your experiences and not what you do.
Mm-hmm.
that ends up distinguishing you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I've been thinking about this. Why is it that in yoga people are attracted to incompetent teachers? I mean, there's one psychological problem. People get intimidated often by people who've done a lot of study or work. They feel often like, oh, I won't be able to understand what that person has to say,
Mm.
or they'll think I'm stupid. So there's that, which is wrong. But I also think, we have this weakness where we want something familiar because that's something we understand. And so, we know what it's like to have neat and different experiences. And so if someone can come back and say, oh, look, I'll show you how to be spiritual, right?
Yeah.
And, like, oh, okay, I like that. That sounds fun, right? And so this is a kind of way in which, like, an emotional need is
Mm.
fulfilled, but learning doesn't actually happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I love that you're bringing this up because it's very interesting. I think we often find ourselves as students putting ourselves into situations because we've been enculturated into this structure of hierarchy. And so we put ourselves in
Right.
the role of being less than
Hmm.
and elevating, the teacher or the guru or the
Yeah.
philosopher king, and then keeping ourselves in this role basically as a slave in a
Sure.
sense, right? Like we're
Yeah.
enslaving ourselves to our as my son calls me, my captor, you know. So we like take a teacher and then
Yes.
become like so devoted that we stop thinking for ourselves and we
Yes.
completely lose this sense of autonomy, this sense of sovereignty because now we're just doing what we're told.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Then that's just acting out the samskara. That's part of the. So we live in a world that's been westernized. So this is just part of like how we're raised. There is the kind of marketing angle too. The more devoted you could seem like to the guy, the more you can be the person who teaches what it is to be in that pyramid. And there's like a kind of there is an advantage to that,
Yeah.
a financial advantage. But I do think that these are all ways in which we're just acting out the baggage that we're bringing. We're not actually doing yoga.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
so that and it's really kind of it's weird because actual yoga is cheaper, easier. It's DIY. It's very kind of like, but it requires learning, and it's not easy to do that. That part is not easy because you have to have, like, it's hard to do things from scratch. Like I do a lot of things from scratch. It takes a long time. Like my research is all from scratch. No one taught me this stuff. Like I had to go like painstakingly. Like I did a PhD on translation, and then I translated the Yoga Sutra. Nobody came up with an account of how to do translation that solved these problems. I had to figure that out. Then I had to translate the Yoga Sutra. Then I had to think about it. Then I had to, like, it's like it's hard. Like I know that people don't have the time or the luxury, but I do think that sometimes these simple ideas of just being devoted to Ishvara and then working on that are like the most
Mm-hmm.
revolutionary.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's how we get over all of this baggage,
It's
right? That we bring.
Yeah.
it is super interesting because I think about you going to Mysore to India as yoga students, and I think like the main kind of tension point in that room for us was when we, you know, looked out at the room and said they're not behaving like Christians. Our yoga teachers aren't behaving like Jesus Christ, and now I'm really, and we don't say it consciously,
Right.
but what we perceive in the room is not meeting up to our Western ideal of rightness,
Hmm.
even though that we went there looking for that.
Yeah.
We went there looking for
Yeah.
Jesus. And even maybe Western liberal ideology, and then we're disgusted when we didn't see it and encounter it. Um, I think I made a transition there. Maybe I just had that thought and wanted to.
I'll take your word for it. I've never been to my store, and if I went, I wouldn't have any of those expectations. But like, I'll
Right.
take your yeah, but I'll take your word for it that people do. They. I mean, you bring your wherever you go, there you are, right? Like, so you
Yeah.
bring all of your stuff with you. If
Mm-hmm.
you haven't gotten rid of it before you leave for India, it'll be there when you show up.
Yeah.
So yeah, for sure.
And it's curious. I think sometimes when we think of philosophy, and I think this goes for every type of philosophy, including yoga philosophy, we feel maybe like it's um, not action oriented. Like this
Mm.
idea of, the ivory tower and just
Yes.
sitting up there and
Right.
contemplating
Yeah.
ideas.
Right.
But your book's called An Action Focused Guide to Practice
Yeah.
Yoga Anti Colonial Philosophy. And so, how do you how is yoga philosophy different in that it is kind of spurring us to action rather than maybe, Descartes?
Great. So good, good, good. So that view that philosophy is something you do when you sit back and just look at the world, right? That goes back to Plato.
Yeah.
And that's a model, but he did stuff. He wrote stories. He lived a life. He wasn't the guy in the story. And like I think Plato should be. It's the problem is that people take him too seriously instead of sitting back and going, "Hey, this is a funny story." So that's what happened in the Western tradition. People they're like, "This is the way we got to do it," and so it becomes part of the deep part of the samskaras. The church basically, like Christianity, was like a little bit of what Jesus said, and then a ton of Plato and Aristotle, and that was like that for like millennia, right? And and so we that's where we learn these stereotypes about what philosophy is. But philosophy is about understanding options at a very abstract level, and then in a way that allows you to choose. That's the way the Yoga Sutra starts. But that when you understand that that's what philosophy is, it takes a lot of work. And then if you think about where yoga came from, it came from this time in India where people were very experimental. They went out and tried things. Like the Buddha is said to have tried all sorts of things before he settled on his position. So I think, this idea that we're just kind of philosophy's just this thing that we do while we're sitting is a story Plato told. He literally told that story, right? um, and I think it's funny that we believe it, right? So that this is just another way that these samskaras they have kind of deep roots in us.
Yeah. Yeah, and it seems like a lot of yoga practitioners, don't necessarily get into the yoga philosophy. They just use it more as a physical practice.
Right.
And how is that kind of part of the colonial
Great.
structure?
So that's an example of wacky yoga.
Mm-hmm.
So because it's a way to appropriate something non-Western and not change anything in your life. So you leave all the moral political infrastructure of your life in place,
Mm-hmm.
but now you're a yoga teacher or now you're a yoga practitioner. And then this doesn't have to cause any serious waves. Um, and the allergy that yoga students have to learning philosophy is completely colonial trauma
Hmm.
because like colonizing traditions don't want you to think about options, they just want you to fall in line. That's why
Mm-hmm.
the Western tradition is the only tradition that begins with the murder of a philosopher and is that has a series of public executions and persecutions of intellectuals. You don't find that in ancient South Asia. People be like, why would you do that? You just had a funny idea, you don't have to agree with them, but like everything's about social conformity. And I talk a little bit about this in the book, like if you think that thought is about language, which is like a deeply Western commitment, then language is this thing that we can only do with social conformity. It's about
Mm.
fitting in, and language is also something we learn when we're young from older people who are in positions of power, and so we build the patriarchy and the social conformity into our expectations in the Western tradition because it begins with this really bad model of thought. It doesn't work, but anyways, it's kind of a very basic political commitment, and so you know, philosophy is a problem because it asks like, well, what is it to get married, right? And people who want to talk about language are like, oh well, by definition, right? Then they'll say a marriage is between a man and woman, but a philosopher go, but we could still ask the question if that makes any sense, right? And
Yeah.
you could see the frustration of people who are like, just shut up and fall in line. You're
Yeah.
not supposed to ask those kinds of questions.
I think
Um,
that's kind of an essential piece to to also being a white person is the history of violence in colonial and European culture, is just how fucking violent we've been.
Yeah, for sure.
And so much of the way that I think white people interact with the world is a fear of consequences. That we understand just how violent
Yeah.
um,
DNA is.
our institutions of power
Well,
are,
so
and
that's
that we
part of the
will be blood eagled at
yeah.
the first opportunity. And so we try to stay very meek because of just how violent our society is.
Right. We've so this is not learning. This is, well, it's kind of adopting. So this is when, instead of knowledge, we're based on ignorance, avidya. We create a sense of self, asmita, on the basis of our what we've observed, our experiences, and then that constructs a kind of personal prison where we're then happy when things are in conformity with those expectations and then alarmed when they're not. And that's
Mm-hmm.
what klesha is, affliction. So Yoga Sutra Book 2, Sutra 3. So this is what happens when we're colonized. When we're colonized, we take on the external political order as our sense of self. And then instead of acting independently, we act so as to protect it. Because you're right, we're scared. We've not developed any of the tools we need to be autonomous. And we think that the only space for us in the world is this little space of conformity. And if we do anything to ruffle the system, we'll get crushed.
Yeah.
Right. So for sure, I mean, I see that, like, why is it that adults are so scared of philosophy, but kids aren't? Like, you could engage in philosophical questions with kids, and they'll go some way with you. But adults are like, you can see the anxiety if you start asking them philosophical questions, because we've been conditioned that learning is about doing what we're told. You get, and you're rewarded for that, and then you're punished if you don't do. It's not, that's not learning. But anyways, we've been conditioned that way. We get the grades, we get the stickers or whatever it is that our teachers give us. So
And then don't get the stick.
yeah, right,
The
exactly.
sticker, not the stick.
Yeah. And I mean, even if you take away the stick, there are all sorts of consequences for not falling in line, right?
Yeah.
So for sure, we've been. I resist calling this learning, because you haven't learned. But what you've done is you've
Conformed.
internalized the political expectations, and then you act in ways that mirror that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very uncomfortable not to know the answer. I think that's also the anxiety that comes up with people when we start talking about philosophy, is it's more about asking questions and examining things from different perspectives, which, there's not necessarily like a easy answer to
Right.
the question, and so it's really hard to sit, it's uncomfortable to sit in a space of not having the right answer. It's much easier to have somebody say, put your right foot first, and
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Well, I think that's just true of research. Like, when you get to any kind of where learning happens, the answers aren't obvious. I think that what you were describing is the same thing, where we were been told that, like, you have to know the answer, otherwise you're going to get in trouble. And so people feel physically unwell.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, they do. They actually have somatic symptoms.
Yeah, you can go right back to that, 7-year-old self that felt, stupid in the class because they didn't know the answer. Every time
Right.
you have to sit with uncertainty as a
Yeah.
47-year-old.
Right, for sure. Well, the whole thing is designed so that if you don't have the answer, well, then you must be stupid. Like, you were given a test and you got to fill in the blanks. And if we don't know the answer, that means there's something wrong with us. We didn't do the work or something, right? So,
which I think is like brings us back to this interesting sort of definition of tapas, is like being able to free yourself from these past ripples
with discomfort.
Or I mean, with any kind of, I guess, karma that's kind of being projected onto you or that you're carrying with you in a way, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, nobody really ever discovers a solution to a problem without going through this yogic process of like you have to challenge yourself to get over your hang-ups, try new things, and you have to be really quite transparent about what you want,
Mm-hmm.
what you're willing to put up with. That's the way researchers proceed, and so yeah, for sure, we're just not raised with those values, right? We're raised with that, it's just that. So, you know, so when people come to a yoga practice, they're just bringing all of this with them,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
right? And then they're going to want a teacher who tells them, like you say, what the right answer is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's also why younger yoga students have a harder time with philosophy. But when people have been doing it for a while and they get frustrated, they realize that this right answer thing is nonsense. It's just like this guy says do this, that person says do that, right?
It's
You
arbitrary.
start seeing the emperor for what it is, and then you're already living with the uncertainty, so you might as well be good at it, right? So I think later on a lot of yoga students come back to it, but they have to stick with the practice long enough to work through all of this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm curious how you think or what you feel about the sort of this adoption that it seems like a lot of yoga traditions from India and Indians who are sort of taking on this guru role are kind of just perpetuating the colonialization or like the colonization or like this colonial system of hierarchy or like
Sure.
how do we unravel that? Because as a Westerner, it feels very uncomfortable to maybe question the Southeast Asian, Indian
Yeah,
teacher
good.
who's perpetuating
Right.
a hierarchy because we feel like, well, who am
Who am I
I?
to,
Yeah.
As
yeah,
a
yeah.
white person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is why the philosophy is very useful, right? Because if you can actually go back prior to colonization, so as I mentioned in this book, colonization in South Asia started a millennia ago with incursions from the Middle East, and that changed the political landscape in India. And so then you had a shift in what people were willing to say about yoga. So then you had things like the Hatha Yoga Pradipika and then this agoraphobic. So I think like modern yoga is just a continuation of that, which is it's something you do indoors in a nice part of town under the tutelage of a human. And you don't do this outdoors because if you do it outdoors, like whatever power you get will disappear. It says
Mm-hmm.
that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And, there's some kind of spiritual payout afterwards when you're dead. But nothing changes here, right? That's kind of what yoga is marketed for. So when when people are like, oh, I had an Indian and they taught me this, I'm like, well, we have to, this is just, colonialism has been going on for so long that if you want a non-traumatic introduction into yoga, which doesn't simply perpetuate colonial coping mechanisms, you have to go back to the philosophy pre-colonially, and then you find things like yoga. Gita. It's like sometimes you have to stand up and fight the good fight. It's not. There's not this. You're not waiting for the world to be perfect. You have to kind of you have to learn to live your life, and make room for yourself,
Mm.
right? And the neat thing about classical yoga, when we look at the philosophy, is how it's not hierarchical. It's all about your own personal devotion to Ishvara, and then you're creating your own autonomy by way of your own activity. So, I think this is just another example of what we lose when we don't take the philosophy seriously, right? Then we want some representative to be our in, who will tell us what to do, but then we've already bought the hierarchy,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even this kind of way this I'm not sure the word discursive is the right word. Is that a philosophical term? This kind of discursive.
We can use it in philosophy.
This
Conversational,
yeah
discursive.
conversational this
Yeah, yeah.
conversational even like the cover of your book, like you've done such a beautiful job in the book discussing why you used the cover that you did. And so for example, you're using you were perhaps at some point criticized for using a picture of Arjuna and Krishna on the chariot, and like, well, that's martial, and
Yeah.
the Hindutva have appropriated
Appropriately, yeah, yeah,
that
yeah.
for their own kind of violent, oppressive means.
Yeah.
And then it's like, well, then animal rights activists also said, well, like these horses are being abused
Yeah, that's right.
on
I
the
got
chariot,
both. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and that's amazing. And it's like there was an essential piece there that I thought that was apropos, is that, well, in India, and perhaps this is true of climates where human beings arise that are you know uh, more moist. That you're kind of more in tune with other animals and seeing yourself not as as a hierarchy on top of other animals, but just as a part of the environment. Um, Let me apologize for what I just said by saying that polytheism arises more often in moist climates, and
humid.
humid's fine, and then monotheistic climates arise more in desert climates, and so you get something like Islam and Judaism and Christianity arising out of the desert, and you get polytheistic religions coming out of say
The tropics.
yeah, moist climates. So just to say that you're equivocating humans with horses and other animals as a nice thing.
Yeah, I mean the point that the idea that tied it all together was that if you look at that image, all of their interests coincide. It wasn't like the horses were expendable, right? Like they all stood or fell together, and so there's a kind of solidarity that's part of that challenge. And the challenge, there's no safe, there's this idea that there's some kind of safe world out there for all of us if we just didn't, that's not true. We have to create that, and sometimes we have to take a stand. And so I think that's what that picture is about. And also I was like, this is not me, this is just a picture from the tradition, right? So if you disagree with the tradition, fine, but like it seemed to me to be a nice way to encapsulate this idea of our individual interests as something that coincides, and that has to do with our interests in being, surviving oppression together.
I mean, it's also such a beautiful metaphor. I mean, from the tradition of like, yoking the mind and harnessing the senses.
There's that too.
And,
yeah.
I mean,
there's all that. There's also that. Yeah, the Kata Upanishad with the. There's a lot of symbolism there too.
Yeah, it's like the quintessential metaphor of yoga, really, right?
Yeah. For sure.
I want to kind of bring this other point up that I think is interesting, because the Mahabharata as an epic story is also kind of, I think, an example of a civilization developing its means and resources to mechanize a colonization itself, and so there's one society develops more resources and then absorbs other societies around it because they have better tools and to do that with, and I'd like to ask you about the kind of that moral quandary of civilization. And I'm thinking of a particular book that I think is kind of extricable, which is Empire by Neil Ferguson, where he seems to be a kind of apologist for colonialization, an apologist for violence. Really.
Yeah, I don't know that book. Maybe I should, but I will say this, that imperialism and colonialism are not the same. And here's the difference, but this is important to the question. So, imperialism is about power, but in the case of empire, subordinates are still able to contemplate alternatives, and sometimes they make calculated choices as to who they're going to be a vassal for.
Mm-hmm.
In colonialism, you have the imposition of one choice and an existential prohibition against contemplating alternatives. So the case of residential schools where indigenous kids were kidnapped and then forced to be some type of Christian and not speak their indigenous language, but either French or English, is like a perfect example of colonialism. Because like I think ordinary school is imperial. So when we're forced to go to school, there's power. We don't really get to opt out, but we
Yeah.
can still understand alternatives, right? We know what it is to skip, and the scenarios, if it's done properly, is there to foster our exploration of alternatives. And it could be done well. It's usually not done well, but at least in theory, it's still a power structure.
Yeah.
Right. Like you could
But
pick
it,
a public school or a Steiner school or a Montessori school or an art school or
But
French school
well,
or
you're gonna get
Spanish
well,
school.
schooled either way.
there's that freedom, but as a student, like you don't really have a choice, right? Like you have
Yeah.
to go. So there's that power, but like what you do and how you do, and like there's still a lot of room for like variability.
Mm-hmm.
But like residential schools weren't schools. They're like just schools in name only. They were like systems of abuse to try and force you to just have one perspective. So I think the Mahabharata is not about colonialism, but about imperialism.
Yeah, forgive me. Yeah.
That's okay. That's okay. But this is interesting because what it does track is the way in which one party starts to become increasingly oppressive, and the Kauravas, they're trying to kind of move to this tyranny of colonialism, and then the Pandavas, they're trying to be good,
Mm-hmm.
and the story is about how they become suckers because they're so interested in just their own goodness
Mm-hmm.
that they end up tolerating and then participating in their own oppression.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Gita is like, well, they have to, like, once they come out of exile, the Pandavas come out of exile, and then they see Krishna's. So then they're doing Ishvara Pranidhana, right? So they seek Krishna's advice, and then they realize they have to stand up for themselves. There's really no. And then Gita kind of celebrates this at the start, where Arjuna tries to wiggle out of it with his arguments as to why he shouldn't fight, and Krishna's like, you got to do this.
Yeah.
But I think it is an interesting exploration. The South Asian tradition, people love to kind of there are all these colonial stereotypes about kind of the tradition as oppressive, but like no, they thought about oppression all the time. Their stories are about oppression and how do you deal with oppression, right? Like you can't read the Ramayana or the stories of Krishna or the Mahabharata without realizing that oppression is the main thing they're concerned about. And what is it for us to live a just life free of oppression? How does that look like? What are the kinds of choices we have to make, right? And I think the Mahabharata is a really interesting exploration because it's not utopian or dewy-eyed about the prospects, and it's quite clear about the costs.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's neat that yoga shows up as like the solution. That at some point you have to be devoted to sovereignty to reset the moral order, and then protect yourself and those who rely on you. So that was another reason why I was like, I think this has to be on the cover.
Well,
That's good.
it's I yeah, I'm not sure what to do about it, and I don't know if there is anything I can do. Right? I think about the Vikings coming down to France and colonizing Brittany, and marauding and killing as they go. That's colonization. But then you have the Italians or the Romans coming north to France, marauding and killing, and taking over and killing the Celts of France, and that's imperialism.
No, that's wrong. That is colonialism.
That's colonialism.
No, that's incorrectly. People talk about the Roman Empire, but
Yeah.
it was definitely a colonial. It was genocidal, right?
Genocidal, colonial.
So
Yeah.
that that's kind of the important difference between imperialism and colonialism. Colonialism will have a genocidal component because what you're trying because the cost of enforcing a single option is the death of people who don't fit in.
And but I suspect that this is the heart of every kind of imperial enterprise is violent oppression.
Well, you can have right, but you can have violence and imperialism, but that does the kind of the main point isn't to make it impossible for you to contemplate options.
Mm-hmm.
Just like you're going to do what I want you to do or else, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is very different from we're doing this.
Mm-hmm.
right? So colonization there isn't kind of this inducement to
Mm-hmm.
try and get, it's like, it's this straight imposition.
Right.
So it's a difference between like mere coercion and assault,
Yeah.
right?
Mm.
And
D-
there can be a gray area clearly, but at some point it becomes colonization. Um, and I think it's interesting that like for in the South Asian tradition, they were like, that's a line that we can't, like that's a clear line.
Genocide.
Well, the colonization, because that then there's no way to even kind of formulate what the options are, right? So the
Mm-hmm.
tyrants were always these kinds of colonial characters, and
mm.
Mm-hmm.
and everybody else was like, hold on, that's not right.
Yeah.
That wasn't just seen as like kind of the price of like politics,
Right.
but in the Western tradition, it's kind of treated as like the price of politics, because it starts off that way, right? When you look at the way Plato dreams of like the idea, it's a colonial environment where everything is curated, even the music you're allowed to listen to is curated,
Mm-hmm.
and the stories that you're allowed to read, and no outsiders, and so yeah.
Do you
Well,
think that
just one follow up is that my fear is that development is essentially oppressive and violent, and but the alternative of living in a kind of anarchic village without
Oh,
industry,
right. So
or
that's the propaganda,
yeah.
that there's a really only one way for us to have a just world, which
Mm-hmm.
is oppression, which is like a paradox. But that's that. I mean, once again, Plato, like he says these things, and you're like, is he joking? Like because, uh, he starts off wanting a space of freedom, and then it becomes a place of oppression. It was a dialogue. It was a story
Mm-hmm.
that he wrote for us to explore, but it becomes the blueprint.
Yeah, he
Uh,
says if our society will be vegetarian, fine. Then the rest of this treatise on the Republic isn't necessary.
Why? Sorry, he thinks it's necessary because the well-ordered society has to mirror the structure of the soul.
Mm-hmm.
Like he's got all these stories. But anyways, the main thing though is that if you think, let's just kind of take this down, chunk it down a level. If you think that language is really the basis of thought, you're going to get all of this together. You're going to get social conformity as a requirement
Mm.
for social interaction. You're also going to get patriarchy, because that's how we learn our
Mm-hmm.
first languages. So if we just get rid of that model, right? There are all sorts of indigenous peoples who didn't have. So I would recommend the beginning of everything by Graeber, and
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
I was thinking of debt when I was thinking of the alternatives.
yeah, yeah. So like the Wendat, right? Like so these are people that live around where I live now in Toronto, and there's all these really interesting stories about how they lived, right? And so they had social organizations where the leaders had no coercive power. So if they wanted people to do things, they had to convince them.
Mm-hmm.
So people spent all their spare time arguing with each other in the community square. They still did things. They lived very advanced, um, prosperous lives, but it was just different. It's not part of our Western imagination, and that's kind of one of the things that they wanted to point out, that there are all these options and we don't allow ourselves to think about them,
Mm-hmm.
right? And yeah.
Mm. That's good. I put David Graeber in my notes to talk with you about this.
Do you think
Cool.
that like every community um or then society eventually though is it a natural progression like Plato's saying? Do we seek freedom, like we enter the
Oh,
commune seeking freedom, and eventually it turns into like a totalitarian dictatorship?
there's so many places where that never happened. Like if we're looking at this as like an empirical question, there's
Yeah.
just so many. There are indigenous, so there are colonizing traditions, and then there are indigenous traditions,
Yeah.
right? And they just had different kinds of lives from the ones that we're familiar with. So, the idea that there's some kind of inevitability. I think also just like, what are we talking about? Are we talking about people within a certain cultural tradition, or are we talking about individuals who are really devoted to sovereignty, right? So, like, there's a more basic political choice we have to make, because those are moral choices, because that that conditions the outcome, right? That's what we learn. That this is where the South Asian tradition started. This wisdom of like the kinds of choices you make are going to have consequences, right? And you will live that. You will live those consequences. You should think very carefully about the kinds of choices you're making, right? That's why karma, action, was such an important thing for them.
Mm.
Um, so I don't know why we would think there's inevitability if there's choice, right?
So,
But that's
Yeah.
exactly what colonialism wants us to believe. There's no choice. We have no options.
Right. And it's again about propagating fear and just our responses to choice is, well, we're afraid of being hurt.
That's I think a downstream mechanism that keeps it in place.
Yeah.
Because like people can try and scare you, but if you're not buying, like if you're not biting, it doesn't. You can think about the crazy uh like the madness people used to spew about heavy metal music in the 80s,
right.
right? Like devil were like
Or
and
yeah,
like
Dungeons and Dragons. Yeah.
yeah, and I'm like I everybody I know who loves or they're sweet people. Right? They just get up and play loud music, and then there are all these people who are really horrible people who are like demonizing people because they like loud music. But where's kind of what's the origin of the fear? It's the mechanism that's keeping that in place, right? So that's our klesha. That's
Yeah.
our that's really the egotism, the asmita, and
Mm.
the way it manifests itself is because we've confused this outlook with ourselves. Our own agency creates this fear. That's why it's described as a fear of death,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm.
We're scared of dying. What does that mean? Leaving this space that we've defined as ourselves, right? Because
Yeah.
if I leave the cult, what's going to happen to me?
Yeah.
If I just do something different,
Yeah.
you know, will I just disappear? It won't happen, but we are so scared about it then. Like by the time you've been in a cult for so long and you've been programmed, but that's just what Asmita does.
Yeah.
You know, it just internalizes these mechanisms
Yeah.
And a
of
cult is
oppression.
also just it can also be in the cult of colonial ideology that we live in,
Yeah,
and
yeah. I
includes
mean,
all the institutions that we take part in when we go down to the
for
bank
sure.
and the church.
Yeah, well, but the mechanism is ourselves. So that's what's so empowering about yoga, because it's like it's not we can blame everybody else all we want, but like what's our role in our own oppression? We have to look at the ways in which we're either our own ally or we're not.
Mm-hmm.
And blaming everybody else won't help you. like, like for everything won't help you kind of. And I think this is also a weird part of why people don't want to go to the philosophy, because they don't want to think, maybe I made a mistake,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because that's punishable, right? We've been taught that if you made a mistake,
Yeah.
you will be punished. But like in yoga, it's like, oh, I don't have to do that anymore. Like that's a good thing, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
it's not
Totally.
a scary thing. I don't have to make that mistake anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I love this idea of like really looking at, as a yoga practitioner, putting this value of Ishvara Pranidhana, or your own sovereignty, or you know putting sovereignty as the essential um, practice, I guess, or value
Yeah,
that you're moving towards. Um, because then if you value your own sovereignty, then also you need to value the sovereignty of
Others,
everyone else as
including
well,
including
right?
horses.
yeah. So the sovereignty, the reason why it helps you get over selfishness is that it's an ideal. It's not
Mm-hmm.
you.
Mm-hmm.
You don't own it.
Yeah.
It's this procedural ideal, and so the more you are devoted to it, the more you're getting over your own selfish orientation in the world, because that's a limitation to your own independence. And so what that helps you do is see the ways in which we share this interest,
Mm-hmm.
and so then um, you can be this idea of like self and other as a conflict of either having to be altruistic or concerned about that disappears. It's a nonsense distinction, because we have the same interests to
Mm-hmm.
be quirky individuals.
Mm-hmm.
And so the the more I can create a space that's safe for quirky individuals, the more quirky individuals will be safe, right? And
Yeah.
so it's an inclusive thing, but I don't have to worry. I'm not really um, worrying about others because I'm more worried about disrupting the systemic harm that keeps us from appreciating our own independence.
Hmm.
And so our own independence is always opposed to conformity.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So then we
Yeah.
have to kind of look at all the ways that we're enforcing conformity in our lives and in other people around us.
Yeah,
Mm.
I think I think that kind of comes from the your own. So when you do this practice, you start to notice your own issues, right? So you're like, okay, I'm going to be devoted to Ishvara, and you're like, why do I don't want to do this, and what's my issue with that, and right. So it pretty quickly the baggage becomes the problem, and then you
Hmm.
start to think about the ways in which you've given it so much power in your life,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah, there was a lot of there has been a lot of talk in our yoga community about the the propagation of violence um, that we're putting on each other, through adjustment.
Yeah.
The adjustment is this idea that we're cutting through habitual patterns with force and heat and pressure, and but and
It's the weirdest thing if you ask me, because the idea that someone else can make me free, right? That someone else can somehow do this, it has to be me. Otherwise, anyways, I think it's just the weirdest thing.
right, but it's like they put the onus on you. It's like you have to release and make yourself vulnerable to adjustment in order to achieve change. And it's like, well, this really hurts. and
Yes.
and then the very first thing that I did in my very first yoga class, and it was like to propagate that violence, and to be really frustrated when people wouldn't submit.
Yeah. Because that became your prison, that
Yeah.
became your asmita, and then you were happy when things were going in that way, and then upset when they weren't.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we create this false sense of um, survival anxiety, right?
Mm-hmm.
By these kinds of identifications, for sure.
Yeah.
It's so interesting to think, because also, like, as a teacher you can perpetuate that kind of dynamic, but also the student can perpetuate it
Yeah,
too. Like, hey, get over here and help free me.
yeah,
Harder,
for sure.
harder.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I do think that this kind of betrays a fundamental misunderstanding of the project of yoga. It's not about outcomes, it's about your own self-determination and self-challenge, right? It's about procedure, not outcomes.
Mm.
And the whole adjustment things makes it seem like it's about the outcome,
Mm-hmm.
right, of achieving a certain posture or state, and that just isn't yoga. Like, right,
You
it's
brought
just not yoga.
you brought this up again in your book, and I really love this, and I wonder if you could talk more about it, because I feel like the model of yoga practice in the Ashtanga form was quite similar to the, say, kung fu or karate, where you get an achievement based on a gold star, a sticker, a belt, a piece of paper saying that you're certified,
Right.
and then you have an achievement, and you have to go through this physical process to achieve that, and then it becomes I think very quickly a kind of addiction to achievement. And you talked about yoga being uh, anti-yoga ties you to addiction, and I wonder if you could talk more to that. And maybe that's not exactly what you said. I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, I think addiction. I think what I have said is that, like, when we are worried about just reducing harm or bringing about some outcome,
Mm-hmm.
we are then willing to do whatever brings that about, but that doesn't necessarily solve the problem. It just kind of can indemnify, like, it can make it more entrenched, right? So if I want to solve like, I'm in pain, and then I think that's the problem. The problem is that I'm in pain, right? Not So like there's another way to think about, like, if I'm feeling unwell, the problem isn't that I'm in pain. The pain is a symptom of my lack of autonomy. It's a symptom of a, like, I'm just not living my life the way I want to. And one of the ways it's expressing itself is in this discomfort I have. Now, I can certainly take a Tylenol, but I'm not treating the pain as though that's the problem, right? So then I could have a more holistic way to deal with myself, and then create a different kind of life because I'm focusing on my own independence, and then where the pain becomes less expressed because I'm living the life that I'm choosing to live. Or I can just make the pain the problem, and then this is consequential. The end justifies the means, and so then um, I do whatever I need to get rid of the pain, and so then I just start popping pills, and then I become an addict,
Mm-hmm.
right? And your body will just reset what normal is,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then you'll need more of those pills, and at some point there's just not enough pills in the world to solve the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I just, I think that this just is what happens when we think that um, it's the quality of our experience that's the problem, right? Because, Harmony, you mentioned earlier, like when you're doing tapas, sometimes it's like not a pleasant
Yeah.
thing, right? But like you don't dwell on that because that's not the point. So like when you go to the gym and you do something really exerting, yeah, it's uncomfortable, but you did it. That's cool, right? So, you're kind of happy for yourself. Or like when you're trying to build something or do something, sure, there's going to be frustration, but you're focused on the doing. Um, so yeah, so it's very easy to get distracted by experiences and feelings, and make that the point,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so I think that has to do with the basic moral theory. Are you a consequentialist? Do you think that there are certain ends you should be achieving and certain ones that you should be avoiding?
Mm-hmm.
And then if that's your way, I think it's difficult to avoid addiction and those kinds of problems. Or this kind of radical procedural approach of devotion to Ishvara, where it's about the doing,
Mm-hmm.
and the more your life is about you doing, the better your life, right? So the quality comes just as an outcome, or as a kind of side effect of the more intensely lived life.
So when we look at yoga, can you just talk us through, like, if you were practicing yoga as a consequentialist, then the whole point of yoga would be to, say, achieve some state of union or state of
Good.
perfection
Yeah.
or
Right.
good, or yeah, and then
So
yeah, can you talk us through the
for sure.
philosophical
Yeah. Yeah.
systems or ethical
Great.
theories in relation to yoga?
Love to. There are four basic ethical theories in South Asia. We only have three in the West, and what's missing is yoga/bhakti. Every basic ethical theory is an account of the right choice or good outcome, the right or the good. Virtue ethics says you have to be a good person to make the right choice. If you're not a good person, you gotta go find someone who is to tell you what to do. Plato, theism, those are versions of virtue ethics. Consequentialism says that there are these good ends, and that justifies the right choice. So you have to figure out what the good end is. Maybe it's happiness or the reduction of suffering. And then whatever brings that about is the right thing to do. Deontology is the inverse. It says that there are lots of good things to do, but the ones that you should be doing are the ones that you have special reason or some special procedure that will select it. So the fact that it's a good thing to do is not sufficient. You have to have some special reason or procedure that gets you there. And then yoga/bhakti is the opposite of virtue ethics. So virtue ethics says you have to be good in order to know what. So the good comes first and the right follows. Yoga says you worry about the right. So Ishvara is the procedural ideal of the right. And so then you devote yourself. The right thing to do is to be devoted to the ideal of the right. And so what does that mean? That means you try practicing that ideal. And then the good, which is your autonomy, is just a side effect of that practice. So you're not trying, so autonomy is not your goal. You don't have a goal. Well, you might, but that's not the reason you're doing anything. So I should be a little bit more careful. You can have goals, but those aren't the reasons for doing anything. The reason you do what you do is that it's part of your devotional practice. to
Mm-hmm.
the ideal of the right.
Mm.
That's your reason. So for instance, like, so when I look at people who are consequentialists and they say they're doing yoga, my first response is you're not doing yoga. But secondly, my follow-up is that, well, you might think you're doing yoga, but what you're doing is you're using practices that could be part of an actual yoga practice, but you're using them for purely instrumental reasons to get something you think you want.
Yeah.
Okay, so like for example, it would be like if I want to do a handstand and I think that it's excellent to be able to do a handstand and I'm practicing yoga to be able to do the handstand, is that a consequentialist approach?
So if you're you're a consequentialist across the board, right? So you think that the only reason to do anything is for some outcome.
Mm-hmm.
So then you're going to rate your whole yoga practice like, well, what's the point? What am
Right.
I getting out of this?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Achievement
Yeah,
based.
okay, some level of okay. So that would be a very consequentialist driven. So being able to do so. This is where the adjustment thing I think is really interesting because it's not
Yeah.
just doing the posture, but like in a specific way,
Yeah.
right? It's not. So as a yoga practitioner, like doing actual yoga, it's not about the success of the outcome. It's more about like what I'm putting into. That's the interesting part, right? Because that's where I'm recovering my space to be independent.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but so I wouldn't rate the quality of my yoga practice in terms of these external observable outcomes,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the fact that someone else can make themselves into pretzel and I can't. These are not criteria uh, that are relevant. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but if I am this kind of consequentialist, right?
Mm-hmm.
As I get older, I'm going to get upset about my yoga practice because it's not what it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I'm going to look at young people that have a really easy time being pretzels, and now it's harder for me to do that kind of thing. Um, and
And then do you start feeling like a bad person?
maybe, or you might start to feel like you're just not. Um, you might stop practicing because
Right.
the only reason to practice was that end, and you might just change your something else. Like you might have some higher order outcome, happiness, sense of fulfillment, or something,
Right.
and you might just switch it up.
Right. Now I'm going to
Um,
find my fulfillment through swimming instead of
or something else.
asana.
Yeah, yeah. That it's just kind of easier for me to achieve.
Or
Right.
even children's
Yeah.
fulfillment.
Yeah. Okay. So then if you're a deontologist,
Okay. Good.
Mm-hmm.
What does yoga look like?
yeah.
So I think a lot of yoga practitioners are actually they think that like there are these rules and they really have to spend a lot of time perfecting them. And the reason there are lots of good rules to do, like there's Ashtanga yoga, there's Iyengar
Iyengar
yoga, so
yoga.
there are
Yeah.
all sorts of, but they will have some kind of reason as to why this kind of yoga is really the one that should be practiced,
Right.
and then they'll spend a lot of time on that. I think that's a little less harmful because you're assessing the the value of the exercise not in terms of the outcome, but in terms of the reasons to do it. But it is still outcome. There's still an outcome aspect to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's still a kind of sense of like what the thing to be done is. Um,
That's
so you might not judge yourself in terms of like how well you're doing the posture, but you will probably be fastidious about doing an asana practice. So if you get sick or if something else happens, all of a sudden you feel like you're not living the right life. There's something wrong,
Right.
right? If you have to switch things up because you got to spend more time with your kid, you're going to be really upset.
mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Because,
because you
right,
can't follow the rules
well, yeah, yeah.
properly.
The thing that was really giving your life value, you're like, I can't do that. Yeah.
Right.
Was that you were doing it,
Yeah.
irregardless of whether you're doing it as well as the 14-year-old.
Yeah, so it wasn't
Yeah.
achievement based so
Yeah.
much as it was like fulfilling certain
Yeah.
requirements
Yeah.
to
Right.
feel
Yeah. For
good
sure.
about yourself during the
Right.
day.
And so,
Yes.
so just as an aside, guys, the Google says that deontology is the study of duty and obligation. Some of us
Duty
didn't
and
take a
obligation.
philosophical undergrad. Just for our
That's what Google
listeners.
says. Well, then it must know.
We have listeners at home, guys. Just
So yeah, I mean, I think that's telling too, because like you say, if you get sick or you have a child and now you can't,
Yeah,
devote 5-6 days a week to your practice, so many hours a
right.
day, you start to feel like not well in
Yeah,
yourself.
hmm
right. There's something wrong with you. You're not kind of living the right life, doing the right things. Yeah.
Okay, so then we have the consequentialist, achievement based,
the
the
deontologist,
deontologist, the
the
rules based,
duty
and
and
then
obligation.
virtue, our
Oh,
virtuist.
yeah. So these people, um, it's hard to be a yogi really into the, but I think this plays an important role in the kind of in the cultish versions of where it really becomes about what Guruji says and what Guru like people who think that you have to be a certain kind of elevated individual in order to know what to do.
Ah,
And
hmm
typically people don't, we've been raised in the West not to assume that that would be hubris, to assume that about yourself. So then you have to go find someone else, and I don't know how you would figure it out, because if you don't know what the right thing to do is because you're not good, how would you know who to choose
well, then you
anyway?
could like choose a teacher who would give you a new name or a new identity, or you could become
Yeah,
Brahmin because you feel
great.
like
Oh,
you have
those
to
You
be
people.
might feel
Brahmin
like
in
you've been
order
made,
to.
yeah, you might feel like you've gotten this like character makeover. I'm now a better person.
Yeah,
um
Yeah.
yeah,
wear
yeah.
like a white kind of turban.
Oh yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Well, all of that performance stuff, I think of Aristotle whenever I see that, right? Like yoga is just like me showing how South Asian is spiritual. It's a performance thing, but there is, I think, a virtue theoretic. I'm. This is who I am, right?
Yeah.
And so then, but then the virtue theorists will think that, and we're not really encouraged to really. It's really weird because like if you're a virtue theorist, you're also in the West encouraged not to really think highly of yourself, to find someone on a pedestal.
Yeah.
It's better if they're dead and gone, like Jesus. It's harder if they're alive, because then there's like the whole kind of paradigmatic and the weird cult of personality thing. But um, they'll either easily fall for some creep to be their boss, or they'll just start putting on airs about how awesome
They are.
awesome they
Yeah.
are. They'll try to create their own little
Yeah.
community of like followers, right?
Right. Or maybe they do all the things that create status. So you study the scripture, you can chant Sanskrit, you
It
can.
that yeah, I mean you have to have the pro, like you. I mean this is all variable, because like you have to think that that makes you a good person, right?
Right.
But
hmm
it
Yeah.
I do think for a lot of people, I don't quite understand the fetish for kind of the cultural knowledge of South Asia, except for like, well, I think that's also very Western. It's very Western to think that culture is knowledge, and so again, it comes back to language.
hmm
Yeah.
But I definitely think that like the consequentialism is like a big thing. The This probably drives a lot of people to get into yoga. Like I often hear people say things like, the goal of yoga is to ease suffering or something. I'm like, that's Buddhism. Buddhism is about easing suffering. Yoga is like that isn't a priority, because that would be like mistaking a symptom for the problem.
hmm
Um,
Yeah.
so,
How?
but what I think is interesting about the virtue theoretic, the consequential, and deontological is that they coalesce into what I call conventional morality, and this is actually what the Mahabharata is kind of about, where you have these people who they want good, and they want to be thought of as good people who do good things and work towards good ends. Those are the
hmm
Pandavas.
Yeah.
And then they get like taken for a ride
Yeah.
because they're so fussed about being good, they don't stop to think about what's right.
Mm.
And
Mm.
then they're willing to put up with a lot of injustice, because they think that to complain
Mm-hmm.
would somehow ruin the goodness of
hmm
the. So I think that's very normal. People
Yeah.
are so fussed about being good, aiming for good, doing good, that they don't want to stop and go, hey, this is really messed up.
Yeah.
Right, like,
Right. Yeah. And
yeah,
so like to practice yoga is to be more devoted to what's right, and what's right is
Ishvara.
Ishvara, and honoring your autonomy, your sovereignty, and other people's sovereignty and autonomy.
Right. So sovereignty is an ideal we have all in common, and autonomy is an outcome of taking that seriously. So as a devotee to Ishvara, I'm not worried about my goodness. I'm not assuming I'm good. I don't need to be good to practice yoga. Um, I might not even know what the good out like. I I've been amazed in my own practice about how impoverished my imagination is about how good things can be. So if I sit back and I go, oh, these are the good ends and I want to work towards that, I'm really kind of setting a very low limit based on my past awareness and experience. And sometimes you start shaking things up and you're like, oh, this is even better. Like I didn't even. So you get rid of thinking in terms of ends because you don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you also just stop assuming that everything you do has to be good. Sometimes you have to do bad things. It's part of learning. You just have to understand that sometimes, and sometimes the bad things just have to be done, like taking out the garbage or like, cleaning things up. There's nothing good about that, but like you got to do it, right? Like there are
Yeah.
things that just have to get, and this is when we start dealing with our own baggage, that's our garbage.
Yeah.
And people don't want to deal with that because it's not good,
You mentioned
right?
that in your book too, the kind of practitioner who doesn't practice because they don't feel that they're good enough to practice,
Yeah,
which denies the fact of practice, that you're
yeah,
practicing to get better.
yes,
I think also even just questioning the whole um, dichotomy of good and bad, and just things are just as they are, and you're just doing the
well,
actions, and it doesn't have to be classified in this kind of
right. Well,
dichotomy
because
as good or bad. It's
yeah,
either,
sometimes it's not clear.
yeah,
Like
moving
you
you to
could be,
sovereignty or not.
so there's right and wrong and good and bad. And
Yeah.
so what yoga is trying to get us to do is focus on the axis of right and wrong and not worry so much about good and bad. Because good and bad, you can be good but wrong, and you can be doing the right thing but bad. And it's much better to be doing the right thing but bad than good and wrong. Because if you're doing the right thing but bad, you're learning, and there's no shame in that. Like that's
Yeah.
just where all of us are.
That's the
Beautiful.
guru. That's the yoga student who runs across the water to his guru because he had forgotten his mantra.
I don't know that story, but what does
he
that
he was he
illustrate?
was he was taught a mantra and he learned it badly and he messed it up and he practiced really hard, and but he said, "Oh, I've forgotten it," but he had won a boon for practicing so hard incorrectly,
Yeah.
and then ran across the water to his teacher's boat to like, please teach me the mantra correctly because I screwed it up. It's like, no, I think you're doing fine.
Yeah. That's a cool story.
Yes, that's a really important distinction, I think. I think that's like the quintessential kind of heart of what makes yoga different than a lot
Yeah.
of our Western moral philosophies, right?
Right, but because the ethical theories we have in the West, virtue ethics, consequentialism, deontology, they all give a lot of importance to goodness.
Mm-hmm.
And yoga's like, don't worry about that for two reasons. When we're starting out, we suck. You have to just be okay with that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Second of all, it's just an outcome. And really, you should be working on the practice because that's going to determine, like, to worry about the outcome is to get things backwards,
Mm.
right? If we can just focus on what we should be doing, then good things will happen.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love that you bring up this imagination too. Like if we're always imagining
Yeah,
how good things can be, we're putting an upper limit on our
yeah,
possibilities, which again, if we're practicing swadhyaya, will help to take
yeah,
away that upper limit. And same with like we all have
yeah,
lower limits too, right? We'll let things
yeah,
get so bad
yeah,
that before it spurs us into action. If we're practicing tapas, then again that starts to get rid of our lower limit, which increases our range of experience in a way.
that's cool. Yes, yes, yeah, for
Yeah.
sure.
Well, I agree that things have gotten really bad for us, Harmony, and And I just want to say that you are helping us get better. And
Thank you.
So-
I'm glad I'm not helping you get worse.
Yeah,
Would be
we're going to
very
take
nice.
right action because of you today.
Awesome. Good,
appreciate
good.
it. You're really just. I just want to thank you so much for making time for us. It's very much an honor that you'd come up onto our podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. It's lovely to chat with both of you.
Yeah,
And
it's been too long.
It has been too long.
You've been very patient with our wrong-headedness this whole time. So I just thank you so much for helping.
No, you were right, but bad. That's good.
And tell everyone where they can find. This isn't your only book. You have a translation of the Yoga Sutras as well. But if they want yoga, anti-colonial philosophy, and your courses, where can they get them? Yeah.
So this book you can buy everywhere, Amazon, etc.
Mm-hmm.
The Yoga Sutra translation, it's hard to find hard copies. I sell them, but if you're in North America, they're hard. They're like wildly priced, like $40 for like secondhand and stuff. So, before shipping. So, yogaphilosophy.com is my website, and I do have a bunch of courses there. You can find the Yoga Sutra there. My translation, but certainly this book you can buy. You can buy Yoga Anti-Colonial Philosophy everywhere. There is a free course that comes with it. So
I should jump into that. I didn't get my free course show.
Yeah, there's a page that says you just go to yogaphilosophy.com courses, and you will find it there. And I kind of designed the book to help people who are doing YTTs. You could use it as the kind of as Russell said, you could use it as like your manual.
Yeah.
And then there's also a free course that's there too.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I think it's an essential text for your YTTs.
Yeah, and you also have a course on ethics as well that students can take if they want to dive more into the virtue ethics and deontology and consequentialism and all the things.
Well, there's a free course that I have on yoga ethics, but then I also have a course called Yoga Moral Philosophy, where we go through the history of moral philosophy from the Western Chinese and Indian tradition, and it really helps kind of clear out what yoga is and how it's very different from a lot of things we're accustomed to.
Yeah, beautiful. You're such a valuable resource to
Thank
yoga
you
communities
so much. Well,
across the world.
I loved your questions. These were awesome. Thank you so much.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was just so amazing. What a fun conversation. I learned so much, and I hope you did too. If you would love to go deeper and take your practice off your yoga mat and into your life, into the world, starting to learn more about pranayama, developing a regular practice, chanting, tuning into the vibrations and the Sanskrit mantras, as well as looking at some of the more esoteric philosophical concepts, come on in to my Inner Circle mentorship. This is a private community that's online. I offer weekly Mysore classes in addition to these monthly workshops and special programs. And you can find out all the information when you join the Finding Harmony community. Head on over to community-harmonyslater.com. Join the community and come on into my Inner Circle mentorship. I would love for you to be a part of this beautiful space and start growing into the full richness of this yoga practice together with me. That's it. We've concluded another episode of the Finding Harmony podcast. I just want to thank you so much for doing the work that changes the world, starting with yourself. It truly does make a huge difference. Please make sure you have your automatic downloads turned on wherever you listen so you don't miss any of the upcoming episodes. I have so much more magic I can't wait to share with you. Lastly, if you're on Instagram, I love connecting and hearing from you. So come on over and say hello at Finding Harmony Podcast. And you can also come say hello to me personally at Harmony Slater Official. Thank you again for being here. I cannot wait to share more with you in our next episode.